Welcome to another episode of my Nazi series podcast, Legacy and Lessons. Me and Michael are continuing our little mini-series on the Operation Reinhardt camp trials. Good morning, Michael.
Good day to you. Good morning for me and good afternoon to you, Johnny. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, thank you. And really looking forward to this podcast as well. Kind of rolling on from Belzec to Sobibor now. So we're kind of midpoint in terms of the Operation Reinhardt camps. And I thought it was interesting to start by comparing Belzec and Sobibor and maybe asking you, where does Sobibor fit in to Operation Reinhardt, and how do you think Sobibor is usually thought of, by historians, people in the field?
Sounds good.
So any first of all similarities between Belzec? What would you say between Sobibor and Belzec?
Well, certainly the modus operandi is the same, right? I mean, for all of these death camps, maybe with the exception to a certain extent of Kelmno, or Kulmhof, as the Germans called it, where you have a gas fan that is the primary source of killing the victims. The Operation Reinhardt camps look very much like one another, and it's not an accident because they were all based upon a single model, and that model, of course, was Belzec. Belzec was the model for both Treblinka and Sobibor. But it's, these are camps in which Jews were sent primarily from the general government, but as we know, the final solution comprehended really all of occupied Europe, or German-occupied Europe. So Jews from all over Central and Western Europe were sent to these camps. That much is very clear from the witness testimony.
So you're kind of touching on a difference there as well, because Belzec, they were processing, probably I should have used a better turn of phrase there, but they were murdering people from the general government, basically the ghettos of the general government. But Sobibor, it has a bit of a further reach. It's quite an important place in Dutch history, isn't it? Because about 35,000 Dutch Jews were deported and murdered to Belzec.
And of course, there were some Jews from other parts of Europe who were murdered at Belzec. It wasn't exclusively Polish Jews from the general government, but that was certainly the overwhelming preponderance of victims of the camp. So you have in Sobibor and also Treblinka perhaps a more multinational sort of diversity of citizenship, but the basic procedure was more or less the same.
It was Wirth's model, wasn't it?
It was Wirth's model, and it was modeled on Belzec, where Jews were brought in, typically on trains, Sobibor and also in Treblinka. They were offloaded, and then they were subjected to a selection of sorts. There were work Jews, the healthier, oftentimes male Jews would be set aside and assigned to the work camp. It was typically subcamp number 1. Usually their barracks were found in the first subcamp of Sobibor. And then the rest were typically sent to the gas chambers. The gas chambers in all of these cases were disguised as shower rooms. So the victims were deceived into believing that they were being sent to the showers, and then ultimately would be assigned to some kind of labor battalion. Of course, that didn't happen. The victims were gassed, murdered, and then their bodies disposed of in differing ways. At first, they were thrown into trenches, and then eventually they were cremated. So, as I said, the modus operandi, the manner of proceeding was very, very similar, if not largely identical.
And I think it was Richard Tamala, wasn't it, who finished off Belzec, and then he moved to construct Sobibor basically straight after. And I think there's another couple similarities and differences, such as Belzec claimed more lives, and we have survivors from Sobibor, more survivors, like significantly more, which is going to affect the trial as well and the outcome.
It's a major difference, major difference, right?
Of the trial.
Yeah.
But before, I was thinking, so when Globocnik gets his green light from Himmler, and thinking about the way that the Nazi system worked was with regards to the Holocaust, the chain of command. So Himmler had Himmler's ear. Himmler had Hitler's ear. So Himmler was one of those people that could go and get direct orders from Hitler, and these would be verbal orders. There's no need to write it down and send it to Himmler. It's just going to make some very, very, very condemning evidence. And Hitler did actually sign an order for the euthanasia program, which we have. And that came out, and I don't think that he wanted to make that same mistake. There's no point in making this extremely, extremely damning evidence if you don't need to. And by and large, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, he certainly came to rue his decision to write that. It's called the Ermächtigungsordnung, the enabling document for euthanasia. It was written on his personal stationery. And signed by him. And of course, all of this came to light then in the summer of 1941. It was deeply embarrassing for the regime. It caused unrest within the population. And they canceled the T4 program, at least officially. It actually continued on a more decentralized level. It's called wild euthanasia. Because even though it was still more or less administered from the center, there was a lot of initiative and a lot of freedom given to local mental hospitals.
And his underlings for the euthanasia program, they wanted that authorization because people were nothing like this had happened before. And these medical practitioners are like, what? So you want us to start murdering our own population en masse? I want a certificate that this is coming from on high. So that was
it was a crime. It was recognized as being a crime. It's a violation of the paragraph 211, the homicide statute. Everybody understood that. And so you have people like Herbert Linden, for example, in the Reich Ministry of the Interior, who was begging for some sort of a law, some sort of a document indicating that they were able to put patients to death. And they got it in the form of this Ermächtigungsgesetz, which is the legality of course has been challenged since 1945, but within the wilderness of the Nazi bureaucratic state, really, it had the force of law.
So he wasn't going to do that again, and he trusted Himmler. So he'd give basically authorization for the general direction of policy concerning Jews, which is sometime in 1941. Okay, we're going to murder them. It might have been staggered. It could have been, okay, we're going to murder the Jews of the Soviet Union. Okay, now let's expand that to Poland and the general government. And then it could have been, okay, now let's keep going and expand that to all of Europe. That's probably how it happened. But he's trusting Himmler. Okay, don't bother me with detail. Just come and tell me when it's done. Really doesn't get into the nitty gritty of the details. And Himmler goes, and this is Operation Reinhardt. Himmler goes to Globocnik, and Globocnik's, I talked about a document last podcast that he sent on October the 1st, which is the language is clearly saying we need a radical and forced removal of the Jewish population of the general government. And it's obvious what he means, and it fits into the timeline. So Himmler goes to Globocnik, and the consensus is they meet on the 13th of October. Soon after, Himmler meets with Heydrich, and apparently for 5 hours they're talking about executions, which is, you can imagine, quite a grisly meeting between Heydrich and Himmler talking about executions for 5 hours. But what my question to you is, when Himmler and Globocnik meet, and essentially Globocnik gets authorization to begin Operation Reinhardt, do you think then that the three camps were decided upon then, Or do you think it was Belzec and Sobibor and then Treblinka came later? Or do you think it was, yeah, I'm going to build 3 camps? Or was it, let's see how Belzec, let's see what happens with Belzec and then we'll expand it? What's your hunch?
Yeah, I mean, Johnny, we just don't know. We don't have the documentation that would allow us to make, excuse me, it would allow us to make a really confident conclusion, or draw a confident conclusion here. At the very least, there was a budding plan in place to murder the Jews of the general government, and probably eventually the rest of Europe. I mean, again, I keep going back to Eichmann's testimony, in which he said, and he was fairly consistent on this in the different interviews that he gave and interrogations that he made, or that he which he was interrogated. He was pretty clear about this, and he said that late summer, early fall, he was told by Heydrich that Hitler had decided upon the final solution. Now, what does that mean in September or October? Does that mean just Poland, or does that mean all of Europe? Well, the final solution means all of Europe, of course, but it's not 100% clear, is it?
No.
So, I mean, I think we would probably have to conjecture whether Treblinka was intended at that time in mid-October of 1941, whether they were planning on including Jews from Amsterdam and other parts of German-occupied Europe, France, and so forth. We just don't know. My hunch is that they did, and that the plan ultimately was to include all of these other groups. But of course, this is a mammoth undertaking, Johnny. I don't have to tell you or the audience how prodigious a project this is. I mean, as they said at Wannsee, they were planning on targeting all 11 million of the Jews in Europe at the time, even in the midst of a world war that they were fighting. So this is a really Herculean task that they're trying to tackle. They have to start somewhere, and my belief is that they start with Poland, but with the ultimate intention of getting around to Jews living in other parts of Europe. But assuredly, there was a plan in place. We know that from the documentation, to murder the Jews of occupied Poland, and also, of course, the Jews of the Warthegau, which was annexed to the Reich. And that was as of October of 1941. We have testimony from, I think it was the station master in the main train station at Sobibor. It was a Polish train station master, who testified after the war that an SS unit came into the town in the fall of 1941 and began measuring the gauge of the track. And it appears, again, if we kind of read this in context, it appears that the SS was already planning the Sobibor camp based upon this interest that they had to ensure that the rail cars would be able to negotiate the railroad gauges in this little town of Sobibor. So in October, it's pretty clear that Belzec and Sobibor were already being planned.
Yeah, at the same time, basically. So they essentially started construction at the same time. And when Tamala had finished in Belzec, he then goes and gives more attention to getting the job done in Sobibor. And I think that they must have been actually quite pleased with how Belzec worked, because this is the unknown. They don't really know, is this really going to work? Is this using this engine? Is this procedure? Is word going to get out so that they'll know that they're going to be murdered when they get here? It's going to slow down the processing time of the victims. But when they see Belzec working in the way that it is, murdering so many people and doing it with essentially not much resistance from the victims, because they've been successfully fooled into thinking that they're being resettled until the very last moment when they're in the gas chamber. So they're probably really pleased. We're probably pleased with how how Belzec's been able to murder people, and it's like, okay, let's roll it out. Sobibor has an interesting place, I feel, in memory around Operation Reinhardt, because of the victim numbers are slightly less. It's seen as slightly less significant, or is talked about less. It's not as prominent, and we think that there's around, I think you might agree, around 170,000 victims of Sobibor, which is
right.
And it's interesting that we because of the magnitude of the other camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Belzec, that we don't really understand the magnitude of 170,000 people in essentially 17 months. That's 10,000 people a month being murdered here, but it's almost overshadowed by the gargantuan kill rates of these other sites.
Yeah, it's much closer to Kelm now. I note in my book, Eyewitness to Genocide, I have a section where I talk about estimates of numbers of Jews killed at Sobibor, and there was some variability based upon the source that you looked at. There's a famous book by Itzhak Arad on the Operation Reinhardt camps, and he came up with a figure. I think he followed if I remember correctly. I think he followed the prosecutor's estimate during the Hagen investigation of the Sobibor camp. And that was a fairly high number. I think it was.
Yeah.
I think his estimate was 250.
Yeah, 250,000. Yeah.
And I think that may also have been the estimate of the Polish Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Poland, which estimated in the 1940s that 250,000 people had been.
And I think Eric Bauer gave an even higher number. He said, "Oh, I think we murdered 350,000 there."
Right. Surely that's too. That has to be too much. At the trial, again, it depends on which participant in the trial you look at. The court came up with an estimate, if memory serves, of around, I think it was 150,000. And the expert witness was Wolfgang Scheffler, whom I actually met at a conference just a few years ago before he passed away. And his estimate, I think it was 151 or 52,000. So it was right around 150,000, give or take.
And it's mainly using the deportation, because we have quite detailed records on the amount of trains that arrived there, and we know how many people were forced. Obviously, they want this to be as efficient as possible, so they're packing as many people into these trains. So we have a good idea of how many people were in each carriage, and we have a very good idea how many trains came in. And the Nazis themselves said that in the Hofler telegram, said that in 1942 alone, and Sobibor, the uprising happened in October 1943, so Sobibor was going for another 10 months, but they said around 100,000 people had already been murdered in 1942 there. So it fits that, 170,000, 150,000 by October. So we have less victims in Sobibor. Now, reasons for that are that Sobibor's actually the choice of location wasn't great, because the tracks that were taking victims into Sobibor, they got waterlogged, didn't they? And the camp was not operational for a while in the summer of 1942. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, there was a temporary pause. I can't remember how long it lasted, but yes, that's right.
And places like Treblinka and Belzec, they are processing victims from ghettos that are absolutely stuffed full of people. So that accounts for the higher victim numbers in Belzec, Treblinka. Now, there was another difference, and this is going to be a good segue to start looking at the trial, is that there was an uprising in Sobibor, but not in Belzec, and there was an uprising in Treblinka as well. Now, the camp Belzec began to be shut down in December 1942, and the last Jews of Belzec were taken to Sobibor, and they were murdered there. And it's thought that in the clothing of the murdered victims from Belzec that were in Sobibor, so the so-called work Jews of Sobibor were sorting through these clothes, and they found notes from the victims of Belzec telling them what their fate was almost certainly going to be. And then this is like a catalyst to these resistance ideas that are already underway. And then importantly, Pechersky comes, so there's a deportation into Sobibor of Russian Jews, and one of them, I think, do you know Pechersky's first name, Michael?
Anatoly? I'm not really sure.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, Pechersky was militarily trained, so he came up with a plan for a resistance and for an uprising and an escape, a mass escape. And the plan was to kill as many SS as possible, to really utilize and play upon their avariciousness, their greed, and get them into different workshops in Sobibor at different times, saying, "Oh, we've got a coat for you to try on." And these people are greedy. One of the reasons that they're in Sobibor and they're not asking for transfers out of there is because they can essentially just go shopping from all the victims' possessions. And I think it's either 10 or 11 of these SS men, and you typically have maybe another 10, 15 more at that time, go to these workshops, and they're killed by the prisoners. And the idea was to take out as many of these as possible, preferably all of them, and then go to like a fake roll call and a capo would then say, "Okay, we've got work to do outside the grounds," and then everyone was just going to walk out. It didn't really play out like that. Like I said, about 10 of them were killed, but some weren't. And then it just became a mad dash to try and get out of the camp. Hundreds of people. Some people, for whatever reason, didn't even try and escape. Maybe they were too scared. They thought they had a better chance of living if they stayed in the camp. But most did try and escape, but there was a minefield outside. So the first people to get out were blown up, and then perpetrators were firing on them as well. So there was a lot. I say somewhere in the region about 300 people stormed the camp and tried to get out. About half of them were just killed in the process of trying to get out, and then most of the people who did make it to the forests were then tracked down and murdered, either by the Nazis, the Germans, their Ukrainian helpers, or by handed over by the local population, or murdered by the local population. So to survive this uprising, I think by the end of the war, do you think there was about 30 survivors?
That's the estimate. Yeah, that rings true. Yeah, based upon the numbers of people who were able to return then to testify in post-war trials.
And we didn't, when we did the Belzec podcast last time, we saw that we had an 88% acquittal rate, and the main reason for that is because there's only one survivor actually at the trial, wasn't there?
Rudolf Rader, whose testimony was almost useless.
Yeah, against this united front of the perpetrators, with no like compelling witness testimony. It must be so compelling to be in the courtroom as the survivors of these death camps are recounting the crimes of the perpetrators, and when it's multiple witnesses as well, and these are just normal people coming up, recounting the most absurd violence that a human mind could possibly fathom. And when there's lots of this, then I think the court are quite convinced of the guilt of the perpetrator, because why would all these people be making up that infants are being picked up by the ankles and swung into boxcars and their heads are exploding, and all of these just insanely horrendous and appalling acts of violence. So to have survivors like we do in the Sobibor trial was a key difference, would you say, Michael?
It was the primary differentiating factor between what happened at the Belzec trial and the events of the Sobibor trial. I would point out too, Johnny, you mentioned just the sheer incomprehensibility, it's just the sheer the sheer wickedness, the evil of these acts. At some of the earlier Sobibor trials involving individuals like Hubert Olmeski, or Eric Bauer, or some of the early perpetrator trials in 1950, the courts really had encountered Sobibor for the first time, and the stories being told by Jewish witnesses at those trials were so hair-raising and so harrowing and so unbelievable that the court basically at one point just had to call a timeout to try to absorb and to try to sort through what they were hearing. Initially, they had a hard time believing that any of this could be true. It seemed to be too horrifying. Just so like something out of the worst possible horror novel that you could imagine. These things couldn't possibly happen in the real world, committed by our own German citizens during the war. Okay, Hitler was bad, but come on, how could people do this to other human beings? As it turns out, it was all true.
Yeah, I remember that same thing happened. We're going to be talking about the Treblinka trial next time. At the Joseph Hertreiter trial in 1951, the court again was just shocked, appalled, and in disbelief. And slowly but surely, people started to understand that this actually happened.
It's almost like a sense of shock that stole over these really early trials of Operation Reinhardt, and they only involved a small spattering, I think there were 3 or 4 guys who were put on trial. A couple of them I think were convicted, and maybe 2 or 3 were convicted, and 1 or 2 were acquitted. But most of them, were just solitary trials, as opposed to these what in German is called the Tatkomplex, right? The criminal complex involving, in some cases, more than a dozen defendants. You think of the Auschwitz trial and the numbers of people put on trial in Frankfurt for their participation in Auschwitz. These are huge trials involving many, many defendants. But the earlier trials were not that way. They were just individuals. But of course, Jewish witnesses appeared at those trials, and the stories they were telling were left the court in a state of disbelief, at least at first.
I can actually quite empathize with that, because I'm still kind of in a state of disbelief sometimes when I'm doing my research today and I'm reading over the testimony, reading your chapter on Sobibor in your book, and reading over the crimes of these perpetrators, the accusations. It still sometimes is difficult to fathom, or it feels like this is the first time I've thought about the Holocaust, because it's just the magnitude and the viciousness of the atrocities is almost
the sadism.
the sadism. It's almost incomprehensible. And these people, we're going to be talking about Frenzel later. I think his first name's Kurt Frenzel, and he had 5 kids himself.
Carl Frenzel.
Carl Frenzel. Yeah. He had 5 kids himself. Oh. How could you go and do this when you know what it's like to have your child born and to rear a child and to care every day, and then just to so callously murder someone else's child?
And to do so in the most horrific ways, right? I mean, according to some of the witnesses, he would tear children apart in front of their mothers. I mean,
I've got some interesting images. We're going to get onto him again, but let's get onto like the image part of the podcast. It's always good to have a look at what images are surrounding these particular trials and perpetrators. So just for a little bit of context, you can see that we have Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka, and you see that they're dotted around, so the intake of these different killing centers so you've got Galicia and the Lvov ghetto that Belzec can take in, and then 80 miles north, you can see that equidistant from from Warsaw. So I think Sobibor was initially going to take part in the murder of the Warsaw Ghetto's Jews, but the camp was inoperational, as we've said before, when that task was given to Treblinka, and we'll see how that went in our podcast next week. And we're again similarities and differences between Sobibor and Belzec. One of the differences is that Wirth realizes that Belzec's quite small, the area, so he's expanded the area of Sobibor. But as you said, modus operandi, the same. Victims are coming here. I think there was a perpetrator called Johann Michael would give some kind of speech saying, "Welcome to your transit camp. You are now going to be assigned work. Germany still needs you. So hand over your valuables and your luggage." So just completely lying to the victims, an important part of the process. Obviously, you've got people that are shocked, afraid. They've been on transports for days. They've seen people die in front of their eyes. That's what they are dying to hear is, they're just hoping that they're not going to be killed. So apparently when he would say this, sometimes the victims would start clapping to just an awful.
Could I interject something here, Johnny?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I'm working on a documentary film right now on Chelmno, and I boggle at the commonalities between these camps, right? Because at Chelmno, an almost identical speech was given. In fact, it was called die Ansprache, and the court records you see reference over and over and over again to die Ansprache, which means the speech.
Mm-hmm.
And the speech was typically given by one of the officials within the camp that reassured the victims that they would not be harmed, that they would be they would take a shower, they would get deloused, their clothing would be deloused, and they would then be reassigned to some sort of labor detail. And so you see this commonality between Chelmno and also with Sobibor in this case. There are a lot of common denominators, and that's not an accident.
Yeah, Wirth's done his research.
Beert is I think the common denominator here.
This is just, these killing centers are so diabolical, so appalling, but they're done very successfully with. If these perpetrators had applied themselves in different ways, they're obviously very competent people. So they've planned this, they've prepared it, they've researched it, and they've pulled off what they wanted to do very successfully. And a detail that you mentioned before was that the person giving the speech would be wearing like a white lab coat as well. And apparently Johann Michael would wear his white lab coat as well.
Just like at Chelmno. Yeah.
And so, yeah, you can see that the camp is enlarged compared to Belzec. So everything's going to be contained within the grounds. And so they'd arrive at the ramp. And this, we'll actually see some pictures of what this looked like in a moment. But this would be, again, another layer to the deception, is that the front camp apparently looked a bit like a Tyrolean village. So nice buildings, flowers have been planted. So you arrive, it masks the ghastly purpose of this place. So it's just layer upon layer upon layer of deception. And then you've got the different camps where Jewish slaves would be kept, so the so-called work Jews. And then you've got different workshops. So this is where most of the SS will have been murdered during the uprising. And then you've got Camp 3. So this is the tube where the victims would be chased down. And then you've got Camp 3. And if you were a slave that was being kept in Camp 3, you wouldn't, I don't think any Jewish survivors of Camp 3, the extermination area, because they couldn't take part in the uprising because they're contained in this place, and they're trying to make sure that even the Jews here don't see what's going on in Camp 3. Obviously, this is going to be by far the worst work that you can do in the killing center, because you'll be cleaning out the gas chambers, you'll be washing the gas chamber walls, you'll be pulling teeth out of victims, you'll be stacking corpses, cremating them, or just the most unthinkable things that you could possibly imagine. And then we have, and I don't know if you have ever seen a picture of this guy, Michael. Do you know who this is? You do?
I think it's
I was quite
Dietrich Zweig, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I was quite happy to find a picture of him, actually. Searched high and low, and eventually in like a German language book found a picture of him. And nice. This is probably going to be the most positive part of the podcast, so we can talk
Oh,
very positively about someone.
Exactly. He's a heroic figure. Again, there are heroic figures in this history. It's important to point them out.
So what exactly did he, just briefly, what exactly did he do, and what role did he play in the Sobibor trial?
Well, he was an investigator for the central office, die Zentrale Stelle in Ludwigsburg, and was the lead investigator for Sobibor. He basically put together the case more or less. I mean, there were other people involved too, of course, but he was kind of the heart of the investigative team that located witnesses and also prepared lists of defendants. It's very important that this happened because the statute of limitations was on the verge of lapsing in 1960. And
so just explain a little bit, because he is constantly, when he's sending letters out, he must have gone to bed thinking about the statute of limitations, and then woke up, it's a day closer, it's a day closer. Exactly. This is obviously on his mind. Just explain a little bit about what the statute of limitations was and why he was so bothered by this.
Yeah, of course, there in all modern legal systems, there are statutes of limitations. I'm sure they have it in the UK as well, certainly in the United States, both in civil cases and criminal cases. And what this does is to impose on the government a time limit as to when they can institute a trial against somebody. If you don't bring a trial within a certain number of years, depending on the kind of case, right? But if you're the government and you don't actually initiate the case and prefer charges against somebody within a specified time, then the case becomes stale, becomes time barred, and you can't pursue after a certain date. You can't pursue any proceedings against that person. So 1960 was a time when the statute was supposed to run. That was the time bar was supposed to be imposed against many of the sorts of offenses that would be charged against potential defendants at a Sobibor trial. So Zweig was in a situation where he had to come up with, basically with, and I'm using American terms now, so forgive me, but it's the German equivalent of what we in the United States call probable cause. I think in German it's hinreichende Tatverdacht. It's a mouthful, but it basically translates as for us probable cause. You have to have probable cause to believe that a person committed a crime in the camp, and if you didn't have that, then you couldn't prefer a charge against them, and the case would be completely time barred, and the person would be beyond all earthly justice at that point. Maybe they would.
So it's a race against time for him. You can kind of feel it, can't you? That he's racing in the way that he keeps on mentioning that the statute of limitations, he's racing to try and can he apply for some kind of extension for this statute of limitations, or if he files the case, or is there some way that he can prolong the length of the statute of limitations if he can prove that he's got a decent case?
No, the only way that it's a complicated history, and we could even devote a separate podcast if you want sometime to talking about this. It's very complicated. But in essence, the way that the Germans dealt with this was politically. So they passed laws in the Bundestag that extended the statute of limitations, primarily though for murder. But of course, there were lots of other offenses for which Nazis could be charged, including Beihilfe, aiding and abetting murder, aggravated assault, or the German equivalent of aggravated assault, and deprivation of freedom. There are all kinds of, manslaughter, which is a lesser form of homicide, not as serious, obviously, as murder, but still, manslaughter would be barred at a certain point, would be time barred. So the solution to this was through amendments to laws done by the Bundestag. And they were able to do that in the cases, especially of murder. But that was later. That was in the mid to late 60s.
And do you know when West Germany abolished the death penalty? Because that was obviously a very good development for the perpetrators.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. In fact, some of the perps were in 1948, 49 were convicted and given capital punishment. But then West Germany comes into being as a sovereign country, and at that point, with the publication of the Basic Law, the German Constitution, they abolished capital punishment.
Oh,
So,
phew. For like, I think Eric Bauer was given a death sentence.
yeah,
Can you imagine being in your cell and there must have been a point where he was given the news?
he was on death row.
You're on death row, and then you're told, okay, they're abolishing, and then bit by bit, you see that all of basically they're getting more lax and lax and lax, and you're like, okay, at one point, I was going to be hung, and now they're basically going to set me free. So it got a lot better for the perpetrators,
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
it?
definitely. Yeah, I don't necessarily think that had anything to do with a pro-Nazi defendant agenda. I think that the abolition of capital punishment was an effort to try to respond to the era of mass killing in Germany, and the Germans were just not willing to continue allowing the government to put people to death. It's just a bad look for Germany, right? After
Yeah,
1948.
no, I'd be interested to know. I might see if I can do a bit of research about the abolishment of the death penalty in Germany at that point, because it is interesting thinking that there's so many Nazi perpetrators still about and haven't been tried yet, and then you're abolishing the death penalty. You could see why somebody would link this to the Nazi period and thinking that they're trying to get Nazis off the chopping block.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, again, I've not done a deep dive and really given an in-depth investigation into this on my own part, but the sense I have from the reading I have done, I've looked at, actually written at some length about the post-war history and development of the Constitution. I see no evidence that there was some sort of a pro-Nazi bias or a Nazi defendant bias. I think it was again responding to the era of genocide and mass killing committed by the German government at the time, the Nazi government, and an effort to try to rein that in and
stop some of the killing,
and send a shot over the bows, declaring that Germany is different now in 1949, 1950, where we no longer put people to death. The state doesn't put people to death.
And yeah, he was at I told you that I came across that article that you wrote. I didn't get a chance to read it, but I will do. He was at the Eichmann trial, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, amazing. The beginning of the 60s.
Yeah.
It's only just like, yeah, it's only really it's only really coming home to me that you got the Eichmann trial, you've got the Treblinka trial, you've got the Auschwitz trial, you've got Belzec, you've got Sobibor, you've got the like loads and loads and loads of trials happening all within basically months for each other. Some of them are going on at the same time, aren't they?
Yes, and it's interesting that some scholars thought that the Eichmann trial was the thing that launched all of these German investigations into the Operation Reinhardt camps and into Auschwitz. And it's an interesting idea, but it's probably not right. It's probably not true. In fact, I think it was Erwin Schuler responded to this at some point, and he said, "No, it was the Ulm trial, and we were actually undertaking our investigations even before Eichmann was captured."
Interesting. Yeah. But I think he got information from the Eichmann trial, which would later be useful for the Sobibor trial, like the names of perpetrators, etc.
The Israelis were crucial. Yeah, I write about this in my book. Yeah, he was able to gather the testimony of Sobibor survivors. People like Ada Lichtmann, for example, was a really important witness, especially against Karl Frenzel, the only defendant to be convicted as a perpetrator. Right? The others were either acquitted or convicted as accomplices, but Frenzel was convicted as a perpetrator of murder, largely on the strength of her testimony. Other witnesses too, but especially her.
I think out of all the Operation Reinhardt trials, there was only 4 people convicted as perpetrators, and Frenzel was one of them. Right, let's keep going. So I'm not sure if you know which photo album this is from. This came to light, this photo album, quite recently. I think it only came out in about 2020. Now, this perpetrator here, this is interesting as well, because I think this is at Bernburg or Brandenburg, so a euthanasia centre, and it shows the link between the euthanasia centre and Operation Reinhardt. But you have Johann Niemann here, and his grandson gave a researcher a photo album that had about 350 pictures from his time in euthanasia, from working at Sachsenhausen, and then actually some pictures from Sobibor as well. And we have here, I think that this is also Bolender as well. And I just thought that was interesting. They both end up working together at Sobibor. But it's interesting to note that lots of these perpetrators, before they got to Sobibor, had known each other for years. They'd been murdering disabled people together in Germany, and now they found themselves in Poland. So it was like very, very good friends. And they must, like, doing something like this probably helps you establish very close relationships as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a fairly cohesive group from all appearances, right?
Yeah.
They'd known each other at Grafeneck or Bamberg or Brandenburg, Hartheim, any one of them, Hadamar, any one of a number of these T4 killing centers. And then, of course, in 1941, a lot of them are reassigned then to Lachneck and Operation Reinhardt.
And these reassignments, they must have looked at this as almost a promotion. It's a step up, because you can see them here. They're just like basically the clothes that they're wearing, and this is Johann Niemann again, and they're basically burners. So it's their job to take the corpses, do what the Jews were doing in the Operation Reinhardt camps, the jobs that, because you don't have slaves in here to do these more grisly tasks in the euthanasia centres. So he's actually already a member of the SS, but he's given this job of emptying gas chambers and cremating bodies. So he's a burner, so he's involved in the killing process that way. And then you can see a picture of him in Sobibor, and he is commandant of the extermination area, and he's the third highest person. So you just like, I think that the difference between the pictures here do in part help to explain how somebody could want to be in Sobibor and to stay in Sobibor and to not request a transfer. You just, the way that, look at him, the status, the prestige, the extra pay that you're getting an extra 18 Reichsmarks a day just for being there. You can get 600 Reichsmarks a month compared to somebody on the Eastern Front. This is a huge, huge paycheck.
And you get to ride a horse.
You get to trot about like you're royalty, basically. You don't have anybody trying to kill you, basically, because you've lied to the victims and made sure that they're not armed. And he probably isn't having, apart from when he just decides that he wants to indiscriminately murder somebody, he doesn't actually have to have physical contact with anybody. It's not a combat situation. In the warehouses, like, I'll tell you what happened to him in a moment, because he's not at the trial, but in the warehouses, you can just go and get whatever you want, and often the victims would see these perpetrators sending parcels home. You get extra leave as well. In his photo album, I might have a picture of this, but you can see them all in Berlin on a holiday all together with their wives, having a great time of it. And these are some of the, like, it's an amazing. Had you heard of this photo album before, Michael?
With a new one that was discovered in 2020.
Yeah, this Johann Niemann photo album.
No. Comes as a complete surprise to me.
Well, there's a book, and I think like Jürgen Matthaus is one of the editors, so it's like proper top quality stuff from the USHMM. I'll send that to you after this podcast, and maybe somewhere down the line we can chat about it, because there's so many images, and these are just incredible images. This would be not the entrance. The people getting off the trains would not go. You can see that entrance down here. they would go through a separate entrance. This might be it here, but if you were arriving here on truck or by car or something, this is the entrance that you would go through. And you can see the camp here. So this is what the victims would have seen as they arrived. And then this is some of the recreation areas for the staff. You can see that they had really quite a nice life here. Like I said, known each other for ages. Basically, all the food and drink that you would want, and there's lots of pictures of recreational time. This is Reichleitner, who would become commandant after Stangl. And you can see Johann Niemann here, basically trotting around like he's royalty in his SS uniform. And the Treblinka guards as well. This is thought to be John the Maniac. That might be another trial that we cover. These are the Ukrainian helpers that were also in this scrapbook. Some of these pictures, I think, actually made it into Kurt Franz's photo album as well. Which we'll talk about next time. Now, Johann Niemann doesn't make it to the trial, and I'll read a testimony of somebody who was around when he was killed. So this is during the uprising. He was actually the first SS person to be killed by the prisoners. It says, "We sat at the window and looked out at the entrance to Camp 1. We saw Nieman on horseback come riding through the gate, ride up to the tailor's workshop, jump off the horse and go into the barracks. Inside every workshop were 2 of our men. And 5 minutes after he had gone in, the horse suddenly started to whine and rear up on its hind legs. That worried Pechersky and me. We didn't understand what had happened. The following had happened. Schubert Jew was inside. He was shorter than Nieman, and his blow with the axe landed awkwardly. Nieman had cried out. He had not killed him. The horse heard this and reared up. We were very anxious. Then a few minutes later, we saw someone come out of the tailor's workshop and run in our direction. He came over to us and handed us Niemann's pistol. Then we calmed down." And I thought that I just chose 5 pictures out of 350. I thought this was an interesting picture because just the Nazis' relationship with death. You would have thought that they might be conditioned that it was something that was just completely insignificant. The amount of death that they're dealing with, they're murdering millions of people, and you would have thought this might condition them to not really care when some of their own died, but they did take death very, very seriously. And you can see Niemann's casket, I think, is this one on the left, and the way that they ceremoniously buried their own dead, I just thought was quite interesting, since though they just so viciously murdered other people and cared, and just didn't even seem like human life was something that mattered to them in the slightest. But they very, very ceremoniously bury and memorialize their own dead. I just thought there was something interesting in there. We have this person did not make it to the trial as well. Michael, any idea who this is?
It's not Holender, is it?
No, it's Gustav Wagner. Yeah, and he was, I'm pretty sure, I'll have to have this confirmed. Maybe if someone's watching the podcast and they know, this does look like a lot like Simon Wiesenthal. And I think it probably is him. And I think he's tracked him down in Brazil, but Brazil did not want to extradite him. So it was difficult to get Wagner out of Brazil to come and stand trial in West Germany or Israel. And then he died, and the circumstances of his death are still a little bit murky. It's thought that maybe he was actually just killed when they realized that they couldn't get him out. But when you read through all of the victim testimony, Michael, he's one of the ones who props up again and again as being particularly vicious. Is that right?
100%. Yeah, he was one of the excess perpetrators, right? I mean, he's the kind of guy, I think, who would have been maybe alongside of Frenzel and Bolender too, who committed suicide, of course, before the judgment could be rendered against him. but I think he would have been convicted probably as a perpetrator.
Yeah. And then we have I thought that this was a really interesting picture. I think you'll recognize this woman's name. This is Esther Raab.
Of course.
And this is Eric Bauer. Now, there was a coincidence where she came across Eric Bauer at a fairground, which is you can just imagine the situation. She survived Sobibor, and he was the self-proclaimed, actually, called himself the gas master. So he was the person that was croaking the engine into life and murdering thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, and also arbitrarily murdering people. And this is, as we've mentioned, she spotted him in 1949, and then reported him to the authorities. Apparently she went up to him, confronted him at this fairground, and he just said to her, "How are you still alive?" Like, didn't take it seriously whatsoever.
What else?
I thought that was an incredible image, actually. Just came across this earlier. And this is Gomersky, who we've just talked about as well. So you don't have Eric Bauer at the trial because he's already been incarcerated. Gomersky, as we're talking about, this person here, this is on one of those trips to Berlin that I was talking about with Nieman and their wives, essentially. He's also already been incarcerated. And it's not a great picture, this, but I'm just showing it because it's got the perpetrators' names in the dock at the Sobibor trial. So we have, front row, we've got Bolender here, and then we've got Werner Dubois, Dubois, I think that's how you'd pronounce it. We've got Kurt Frenzel here, we've got Eric Fuchs here. We spoke about him last time as well. So he's heavily involved in the gassing technology, bringing the engine to the camp, etc. Him and Eric Bauer, the main two people operating the gas technology. And we've got Alfred Ittner here, who I think did actually successfully get a transfer from Sobibor. And then we have some of these other perpetrators as well. I think 5 of these were also at the Belzec, had also just been acquitted from the Belzec. Lambert was implicated. He's a stonemason, so he's implicated in Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and some euthanasia. He's building the gas chambers, and I'd like to talk about him next time, because I think it's an interesting take on perpetration. I've got a better picture of this, and you can see their defense counsels sat in front of them here as well. And you've got a better picture of Bolender here. He's not looking great. He looks like he's lost an eye as well. He, Michael, you said, would likely have been convicted as a perpetrator because some of the horrendous things that he did. But you said that he took his own life.
Right.
Sure. So he took his own life, like, during the proceedings. Then must have been in in being held
toward the end of the trial. Yeah, in fact, the trial might have been over at that point. They were just awaiting the verdicts, but he committed suicide.
Yeah. And then we have Kurt Frenzel here as well. So this is Bolender as well. So you can see happier times for Bolender. It did not end well for him. And this is Gottlieb Herring, who we spoke about last time, and some of the other Sobibor perpetrators. And we have Kurt Frenzel then. And this is, do you know which interview this is, Michael?
Not 100% sure. I'm trying to figure out who the party.
So this is, so eventually Kurt Frenzel's trying to get out, and he eventually does get out for the last 9 years of his life. But this is Tovia or Thomas Blatt. So this is thought to be, the only time that a victim, and Kurt Frenzel sent his family to the gas chambers as well. So that's why the interview was just such an incredible one. But Frenzel, by all accounts, he is, would you say, Michael, one of the true monsters of the Holocaust?
Yeah, his crimes are so monstrous. and so just gratuitously cruel. His kinds of crimes are the ones that caused judges to boggle and to question whether such things could really have happened. As it turned out, they really did happen, but at the time they seemed to be so utterly beyond the pale of believability as to leave the judges just grasping for some way to interpret it.
Eric Bauer was a really important source of information. Like we said, he'd already been arrested, and he said of Frenzel, he was one of the worst and most brutal members of the permanent staff. His whip was very loose. Victims, as we've touched upon, very, very often, many, many times, picked Frenzel out as being just a sadistic and cruel monster. This Herschel Kuckerman said that Frenzel was a sadist and a killer without conscience. His involvement at Sobibor went much beyond the mass exterminations. He committed numerous other crimes as well. And I showed a picture of Esther Raab earlier. And one thing I was thinking that was interesting to me is you were talking earlier about similarities between Chelmno and Sobibor, and you see these similarities. When I was writing my dissertation on Treblinka, probably two of the most shocking and appalling and sickening acts of violence that I found Treblinka perpetrators doing, Frenzel also did them, and that I found that quite jarring. So there's various different witnesses. He's actually convicted of this crime, whereas I think the court were very sympathetic and generous towards the perpetrators, and they were quite happy to throw out an accusation of a particular murder if they felt that there was holes in the testimony or it wasn't as robust as it should be. But this crime he was convicted of, and Esther Raab was one of the people that testified that she saw a small boy had been left behind in a railed car. Frenzel discovered the baby, seized it by the legs, and smashed its head with all his strength against the wall of the car. Raab saw the baby's head explode from impact, and she stood in court and she's recounted this. This had made her, as you would imagine, a great impression. It was like the manner in which she said it as well made a really strong impression on the judges. And this case is also corroborated by different witnesses. Margulies attested to several incidents in which Frenzel had killed children using the same technique of seizing their legs and then smashing their heads against the wall of a boxcar. And like I'll talk about maybe next week, this is something that Joseph Hertreiter did. It's something that Kurt Frenz did. And there's a part in my dissertation where I've noticed this same method of killing popping up again and again over space and time. It's obviously just one of those incomprehensible acts, isn't it, Michael?
And according to the Jewish witnesses, the murders of infants and young children were routine in the camp. Routine. If not daily, then an almost daily, certainly weekly occurrence in the camp.
Yeah, you wouldn't just, and that's something I don't think I'll ever be able to comprehend, like how other humans could become so desensitized from a very advanced civilization. How these people, like many of them, had police backgrounds as well. And children, like I've mentioned, he's got 5 kids. How you could look at someone else's kid and just so barbarously murder them without a second thought.
My friend, this is why we study this topic as intensively as we do.
And like I said, another thing that really, I spoke about this in the podcast that me, you, and Brett had, where I was reading through crimes that had been committed at Treblinka, and one of them just stopped me in my tracks. Although you read so many of these, they're all just sickening and appalling. But it's the murder of somebody that's attempted suicide. I don't know why that has such a elicits such a visceral reaction from me, but it always does. Do you know what I mean? Like somebody's just
exactly what you
attempted.
mean. There are multiple cases of this. There's not just one, but multiple. And I think it elicits from you a reaction of compassion, because much like a young child, or maybe an elderly person who is really ailing, and a person who is trying to commit suicide is so vulnerable, right? It's so fragile. And in civilized society, people would respond to that person with compassion and with care, right? I think that's that'd be the normal empathic human response to such a situation, but not in the death camp. In the death camp,
No.
you respond to these people by continuing to inflict torture on them and then killing them yourself. How dare they arrogate to themselves the right to take their own lives? Only the SS can determine who lives and who dies, right? That's the clear ideology, clear dogma lurking behind this this cruelty.
And it's, if you consider that Bolender committed suicide, these people that are trying to commit suicide in the death camp and these perpetrators, it's qualitatively just a complete different thing, isn't it? The suicide of a perpetrator, because they've been busted and they've been convicted of the most appalling crimes. It's almost like quite a cowardly act trying to escape justice. But one of the things that is so impactful about people committing suicide in this killing center is just thinking about what has driven them to that point. They really are, in some sense, unfortunately, party to the killing process, and maybe that's driven them, but they've just the things that they've seen and they've heard, and they've decided that they just can't bear any more of this torture, of this suffering, of this torment. The suffering is almost too much to comprehend, isn't it?
The impulse to suicide is understandable here, isn't it? I mean, imagine being in this kind of Tartarian atmosphere. It's hell, right? It is like a glimpse of what hell would be like if such a place existed. Children, infants being smashed against the side of the wall, their heads exploding. Children being torn to pieces. There were some witnesses who testified that Frenzel tore infants apart, limb from limb, and in some cases in front of their mothers. I mean, in such an and of course, you have the Damoclean sword of your own imminent murder hanging over your head if you're a work Jew, for example. You always have that sword hanging over your head, ready to fall on you at any point.
Yeah, you wonder how people, it's just kept going.
Johnny, you would expect that everybody would try to commit suicide under those circumstances. Yeah. I mean, I cannot even imagine what that would do to the human psyche.
Yeah. But you do have incredibly people like Thomas Blatt who do survive, and I think he dedicated his life to relaying the truth of Sobibor, one of the great historians of the Sobibor killing center. But his survival is just, the odds are impossible.
It's phenomenal. It's an extraordinary thing. And the fact that so many of these people were willing to come back, not just in this trial, but in other trials too, including the Eichmann trial, of course.
And to sit across the table from this monster, and the interviews there, the transcripts there, if you want, and Frenzel's just making excuses for himself and just saying that he's repentant, that he was once a Nazi and that he's not political anymore. Basically, can't believe that he got swept along with this, but really he was murdering people far, far above his orders.
None of this matters, right? All that matters is what he did during his time in the camp. That's all that matters.
And so this person that tried to commit suicide at roll call, Frenzel had him brought out and berated in front of other prisoners, and got his whip out and berated him and whipped him as he was dying, and then dispatched him with his pistol. for, like you say, for thinking that he had the right to take his own life. So just a truly sickening individual, and it's hard to take that he spent the last 9, due to essentially on compassionate grounds, he's released.
Yeah.
And he spends the last 9 years of his life a free man, which is just
think about it, Johnny.
incredible.
If he was truly penitent, right? Claims that he had turned over a new leaf or whatever. I'm not buying any of it, by the way, but if that were truly the case, then he would ask for punishment.
Yeah.
He would say, yes, what I did was what was monstrous. It was of a degree of wickedness that cries out for severe punishment, and I'm ready to take my medicine. I'm ready to pay the price for these horrendous things that I did. But of course, he didn't say that at trial, did he?
No, and for someone to do what he did in the first place, somebody with his character would never do such a thing. I don't think I've heard of any cases of perpetrators saying, lock me up and throw away the key because what I did was just so appalling.
No.
But it doesn't surprise me that these people just try and sneak and lie and deceive and slither themselves to freedom.
It's a vivid image. Slithering.
Okay, right. Just a couple of interesting things about the trial then for us to reflect on, Michael. So the main defense was, like the Belzec trial,
Yes.
Putative duress. Is that correct?
Not like the Belzec trial, identical to the Belzec trial. Yeah, putative duress. That's right.
And they're bringing Worth up again, aren't they? They're saying, listen, we were all just shit scared of Worth. Like, if we hadn't have murdered those kids, we hadn't taken part in the mass exterminations, Worth would have either killed us or sent us to a concentration camp. So they're digging up that one again, aren't they?
How convenient too that Wirth was killed in 1944, I think, in Yugoslavia during his work on partisan suppression. So he's not even around to defend himself, and everybody can blame everything on him.
And Worth, I think it's interesting to note that Worth was in his late 50s by this time as well. So he wasn't like in the prime of his life, like a 30-something-year-old. He was, and, given his life of service in World War I and stuff, he's in the twilight years of his life. He can't have been physically. These guys are in their early 30s at the peak condition. And Worth essentially was in the twilight years of his life, in the winter of his life. They surely should have been able to beat him like in a one-on-one fight. I know he's got the authority, but he can't have been that an imposing figure. And Werner Dubois at the bottom here actually says, do you know what he said?
Absolutely. You want to tell the story?
Well, you tell it.
This is the one with the pistol?
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about a story that really belied a lot of these claims about Wirth. So the story is that, I can't remember the specific circumstance that led to it, but Wirth became upset with Dubois and pulled a gun and pointed it at Dubois, and then Dubois responded by unlimbering his own pistol and pointing it at Wirth. And Wirth backed down.
Yeah.
According to the story,
that's an inconvenient story to tell, isn't it? For all of the perpetrators, like you bet you can just bet the other perpetrators was like, what the fuck did you tell that for? Like we're all supposed to.
It's a unified front. We're supposed to be consistent here.
And it doesn't work quite as well as Belzec as well, because in Belzec, Worth's like basically living there. But here, Worth's 80 miles away.
He's not even close by. He just shows up every so often. Yeah. And that was a major factor. You know how initially there was a dismissal of, I think 7 of the defendants were dismissed by the court, and then there was an appeal made to the Oberlandesgericht, and the Oberlandesgericht pointed this out and said, look, if Ert was such a fearsome figure, if these people really were suffering from putative duress, number one, he's 80 miles away, right? He's not in the camp every day, able to exercise his malign, influence like he was at Belzec, for example.
And Hans Gunther Seraphim, was he a historian, Michael?
Yeah, he was we talked a little bit about him last time. He was an expert witness, appeared in scores of Nazi trials, including the Nuremberg trials and including the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, typically working for the defense. But in this case, and also in, was it Belzec too, I think, where he delivered it was Kelmno. It was Kelmno. He actually appeared as a Gutachter, an expert witness at Kelmno as well.
Yeah.
And it's the same testimony. He said that that there's no evidence that these men were forced to do what they did.
Well, and he said that he says, listen, we have searched high and low, so have the defense prosecution. There is no case anywhere of someone being thrown into a concentration camp or killed for not following a kill order.
No evidence of duress, but of course there are two different kinds of duress. Objective duress, where somebody is threatening another person, you do this or I'll kill you. There's an objective condition of duress, but then there's this other variant of duress called putative duress, which you've referred to already. And that's a situation in which a person thinks that he faces a threat to life and limb, but in fact he does not. He does not objectively face this threat. He just thinks that he does.
And that was their most effective form of defense, to say that subjectively, maybe my life wasn't in danger, but I mistakenly thought that it was, and subjectively I thought that I was in great peril. While we're just talking about Werner de Bois, and we're just wrapping this up, I've got a quote from him that I think is quite interesting, reflecting on his time in Sobibor. He said, "Of course, I am aware that the killings were carried out in the extermination camps. What I did amounted to aiding and abetting. If I am convicted, it is only right. Murder is always murder. In establishing who is guilty, it is my opinion that not only the functions should be looked at. Whatever we did, we are all equally guilty. The camp functioned like a chain of separate functions. The whole thing would have collapsed if only one link had broken away. The real work done during the extermination process was carried out by the Arbeitsjuden. They were forced to do it, always in fear of death. All members of the German staff supervised the process and carried the responsibility for the extermination of the Jews. What should be taken into account is that we did not act on our own initiative, but in the context of the Reich's final solution to the Jewish problem. We did not have the courage to resist orders. I was faced with the following choice: either be a supervisor in a Jewish camp or a prisoner in a concentration camp. It's an interesting statement because it starts off like, oh, quite repentant.
It starts off, yes. And of course, that was during the interrogation, I think. Was it not? Was that during one of the interrogations that he made?
Yes.
Yeah, so by the time the trial comes around, he's singing a different story, but different tune.
But he starts off, but also he sprinkles some things in, and I think a few of the perpetrators do this, say that the Jews were the ones doing the killing.
Right.
So he blames it on the Arbeitsjuden,
Right.
on the Jews there. He's like, we were supervising the Jews while they were just killing other Jews.
It's funny how that interrogation morphs, though, isn't it? It starts out contrite. It sounds like he's sounding a note of contrition. And then it ends by his blaming the work Jews for the killing, when in fact it was the SS that did the killing, not the work Jews. The work Jews just removed the corpses from the gas chamber.
I think he's quite clever actually how he starts that off, because people might see that, okay, he's very, very reasonable and he seems like he's reflected like really seriously upon his time there, and he's saying essentially that he was guilty as an aider or abettor. He probably knew that that was the best he was going to get. And he sprinkles in the fact that the Jews were doing all the killing, and then orders are orders at the end as well. He knows very, very well what he's doing, doesn't he?
As you read that testimony, doesn't it sound like he started off in almost a confessional sort of modality, doesn't it? It sounds he started, and then as he's talking to the interrogator, he realizes, oh my goodness, what did I just say? It sounds as if I'm pleading guilty already during the investigative phase of the proceeding, and then he kind of turns on a dime, and then
let's steer this in a different direction here, because
takes refuge in the normal flimsy sorts of defenses that these perpetrators make.
So look, just having a final review of the sentences that were meted down here. So the court and the judges are quite convinced with this defense of putative duress. This is what really helps a lot of these perpetrators out. And also in your chapter, you mention something that I actually hadn't heard of before. During 1942, maybe December 1942, when Hitler asks the Reich what exactly did Hitler request of the Reich, that he be the supreme arbiter of law and justice?
I mean, more or less that's it. Yeah, I mean, he essentially was asking for a declaration of his authority as the supreme lawgiver and law interpreter.
Yeah, and he gets that, and so how does that become relevant during the proceedings?
Well, and it gets to the issue of whether what was going on with the final solution was, since it was in conformity with Hitler's will and was presumably set in motion by an oral Hitler order, whether it was legal. And this is a theme that absolutely haunts this, not just this trial, but I would argue all post-war Nazi war crimes trials. The theme of whether the final solution was legal or not. Of course, the German court system committed itself to the position that it was not legal. It was not legal, but I for one, am skeptical of that. I think that Hitler's will, at a certain point in the history of the regime, did substitute for the Rechtsstaat, for the rule of law. The Germans really fumbled, and we can talk about this maybe a little bit later, either in the Treblinka podcast, or maybe if we have a summation of the Operation Reinhardt trials, we could talk at greater length about this. But I think the Germans really fumbled the ball, we would say, here in the United States, right, when it came to setting up the parameters for their own trials of Nazi perpetrators. They made a mistake. They should have dealt with this in a different way than just applying German law. At least this is my view, and the view of some other people too. But they should have gone about it in a different way than just applying normal German law, the kind of law that would apply to somebody who robs a liquor store, right? That same law is being applied now to the murderers of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And the law oftentimes comes up short, as it did even in the Sobibor trial, with the acquittals of several of the defendants on a theory of putative duress. But this could have been dealt with, presumably in 1949 with the passage of the Basic Law. Again, we can maybe talk about this later.
Some of the sentences just seem a little bit of an insult, actually, as well, and maybe really just basically next to nothing. 3 years, like when you look at what they're charged with, participating in the mass murder of approximately 3,000, is just mind-boggling. And then you look at 4 years imprisonment, and then died in 1980. So what? So good 10 years, free man. You probably that says 4 years, probably out in 2 as well. Good.
What to say?
Good 10 to 12 years.
And don't forget, a lot of them were under arrest at the time that the trial.
The
trial took place. So they had pretrial confinement, and that was counted toward their sentence.
So and I bet pretrial confinement's probably a bit better than after you've been sentenced. The conditions that you kept in are probably a lot better, because you're not a guilty man at that point, are you? and then quite a lot of acquittals because of putative duress. And some of these people, Unverhau, he's been acquitted in Belzec and Sobibor now, and so has, I think, Zierke, and this was one of the own perpetrators. And I think this is interesting to finish on, that some of the witnesses actually spoke, if not fondly, but spoke in his defense, said, actually, do you know what? That guy wasn't excessive, and it just shows that you could behave in that manner.
Yeah, it shows that, and it shows that the Jewish witnesses really were trying to get it right. Again, one of the charges so often against witnesses in a situation like this is that they're boiling with revenge, and they're trying to lash out at everybody, and it's just not the case. I mean, the fact that they were willing to speak favorably of some of the defendants, like Hans-Heinz Schutt, I think is evidence, is proof that the defendants really were discriminating. They were able to distinguish between what one guard in the camp did versus what another guard did, and to give credit to those guards who were milder.
Yeah. Oh, I wish these proceedings had been filmed, and we could, like the Eichmann proceedings, and we could watch them. Fascinating stuff. Okay. Next time we're gonna finish this mini-series, and we're gonna cover Treblinka. I think once we finish this mini-series, I think I'm gonna need to lie down in a darkened room somewhere.
I'm gonna need a drink.
Brutal. Yeah, I'm gonna need a drink or two or three. It's because now I'm going to spend a couple of weeks going back into the most heinous crimes committed at Treblinka. So I'll look forward in a way to that, Michael.
Yeah, Treblinka may not be the Mount Everest of the Holocaust. It's probably reserved for Auschwitz, but I don't know, maybe Annapurna, K2, something like that. It's really an awful place. So we'll delve into that next time.
Okay, thanks, Michael.
My pleasure. It's great being with
you.
you as always, Johnny.
You too, mate. See you in a bit.
You take care.